And if we wanted to take this more to it perspective, we could, for instance, consult the social intuitionist model. The social intuitionist model adds another perspective to morality. So instead of considering, like the Kohlberg model, that everything is basically rational and moral reasoning is largely about thinking our dilemmas through and then making a choice, the social intuitionist model holds that moral decision making is a matter of intuitions. So let's take a look at one of the important gimmicks of this model. And one of these important gimmicks is the so-called moral dumbfounding. What is this about? First of all, let's illustrate this with an example. Here is an example of a dilemma that would be posed to people if you wanted to study moral dumbfounding. So the dilemma would be as follows. Julie and Mark are brothers and sister. They're traveling through France together. On their trip, they spend the night in a house on the beach. They decide it would be interesting to have sex with each other once. It would, at the very least, be a new experience for both of them. Julie takes the pill, but to be sure, they also use a condom. They enjoy the experience, but decide to not do it anymore. They'll keep it a secret, and an experience that brings them closer together. Was it morally okay that they had sex with each other? This would be a question that you could ask participants. And then what we will find is that most people will actually say no, and emphatically so, but they can't really explain why. And that is the reason, because, all of the potential negative consequences are kind of explained away in the scenario already. You have two consenting adults. It only happens once. There's no danger of procreation and then raising children that are unfortunate to suffer from some genetic problems. None of this. But still many people say no, this is not permissible and morally okay for brother and sister to do. So this thing where you are presented with a moral dilemma and you say no, but you can't explain why, that's what we would call moral dumbfounding. And the social intuitionist model basically proposes that this is something that happens to us when we see a moral issue. We first produce a judgment, and only after the judgment are we then able to provide some reasoning. And sometimes even the reasoning, doesn't actually even work out. But it's basically the reasoning, or this model holds that the reasoning is kind of only an appendage to our moral judgments. So it is actually not central to reaching a judgment, but our judgment centrally stems from an intuition. And here is a schematic overview of this social intuitionist model. The idea is that there's a triggering event or a moral dilemma that's being read to you, like the case of Julie and Mark, I believe. It was that vacationing in France that I just read to you before. So we have this triggering event, and then there's an observer, A, who has some kind of an intuition about it. They experience an intuition about the situation, and then this leads to an intuitive judgment, so that then we have the judgment of this person. Only after this judgment has been formed, this is now step number 2, only after the judgment has been formed, then there is some post hoc reasoning. So the judgment's already there, and then it's followed by reasoning, and then only then is the observer able, or sometimes even not, to produce a reason for why they gave a certain judgment. And then we might have some additional feedback loops. One of the feedback loops, which is actually cut off in this graph, you should see it going from the reasoning to the intuition. So our reasoning might change our intuition for a different event. And this might happen through, for instance, social pressure. So you might get some feedback about your reasoning from other people, and then they might influence whether you uphold or strengthen your intuition, or if you kind of adapt your intuition. this can also happen through private reflection, right? You might also think that, oh, the reasons I can come up with for this, for explaining my judgment, are actually bad, or they're actually quite good. So depending on how your personal evaluation, this is line number 6, goes, depending on your personal evaluation goes, then you might also slightly change your intuition based on the reasons that you were able to come up with. And there's also a feedback loop from the reasons to judgments. So if you change your judgment based on your reason, this may happen, then this would be actually a reasoned judgment, right? But the point is that the social intuitionist model posits that, first of all, kind of the natural process through which a moral judgment comes to pass is by being created from an intuition. So not by being created from reasoning. Reasoning only comes after the choice has already been made, after the judgment has already been made. And the intuition is kind of the driving force of making a moral judgment. The social intuitionist model also goes on to include the idea that often we're not alone with our reasoning, right? Especially about moral situations. They often also, trigger other people who observe the same situation, and then we have often also something like a social consensus about what should and should not be done. And that means that there's not only A who has an intuition about a triggering event, but there also might be B who has an intuition about it, and then there could be some influence between the two in various directions. But overall, this is the idea of the social intuitionist model, that moral judgment first and foremost stems from an intuition, and that the reasoning and kind of trying to give explanations for one's judgment, this is only step 2, and sometimes, as in the case with scenarios where we experience moral dumbfounding, we can't even produce proper reasons for why we think or why we have a specific intuition about morality. So now we have two contrasting perspectives. On the one hand, we have the idea by Kohlberg that morality really is something very controlled and cognitive, and it has to do with reasoning, and it can have like different stages of deliberation and effortfulness of making reasoning. And on the other hand, we have the Haidt model about social intuitions, which basically is about automaticity, right? It's about intuitions, it's about snap judgments. How do we reconcile these two perspectives? Well, as with other theories of cognition, we can try to find a way through the middle. We can try to use an argument that maybe sometimes we are rather in this mode of thinking, sometimes we're rather in that mode of thinking. So of course, we can try to employ a dual process theory. And this dual process theory also exists for moral decision making. So you remember the trolley dilemma that we spoke about before, right? And this is a paradigm that's often used to take a look at morality from the perspective of dual process models.